Do you think they're behind us? Valentina asked. Probably. You don't think we've run far enough? I don't know if the moon is far enough. Well, let me catch my breath. They slowed to a stop, and she bent to put her hands on her knees and gasped. Guy didn't seem fazed. He kept an eye out behind them and then checked his surroundings. I love that place, he said, pointing at a sign on a restaurant across the street. It said Riposte. We went because I'm really into fencing and they have swords on all the walls. Fencing? She asked. Sword fighting. Really? She stood up straight. Is the food any good? Are you kidding? It's excellent. Well, let's go in then. I haven't had breakfast yet. Oh, wow, I forgot. You must be starving. The restaurant was done mostly in ivory and burnt umber, their version of black and white. All the furniture was blonde wood that had been painted white and then sanded to let a lot of the wood grain show through and look rustic. Then épées and French poetry in cursive had been stenciled into them in black. There were real swords on the exposed brick walls here and there, and hanging ferns that gave an occasional splash of color. The music was electro swing, old jazz like Louis Prima or Ella Fitzgerald mixed with modern beats. At that moment, the Andrews sisters were singing a funky version of Rum and Coca-Cola that made Guy nostalgic. He indicated the sign with a jerk of his chin. The name means, in fencing, when you parry or block an attack and then counterattack. I think, but I'm not sure, that it means the dishes are their answer to tradition. Other people have been making these meals for centuries, and these fusions are their rebuttal. What do you mean? Madame, Monsieur, a condescending maitre d' said, bowing ever so slightly behind his podium. Deux, s'il vous plaît, Guy said, holding up 2 fingers. Sorry? 2, please. Oh. Guy stifled a laugh at the pompous man pretending to be French, who couldn't understand even that much. They followed him into a table next to the noisy kitchen. Guy said, We'll have a better table, if you please. I'm sorry, the man said, with his nose in the air. That is quite impossible. Considering the escape they just made, on top of all the tension of the morning, they were a little high-strung and less willing to let some things slide. This man would make all that tension come to a head. I'm not above causing a scene, Valentina told him, even though she was. The man snorted derisively. Guy made a show of being discreet, taking a folded 20-euro note out of his pocket, palming it, and slipped it to the man in a handshake. It was one of the counterfeit bills he had on hand to give rude people who expected to be bribed. It looked real enough at a glance, but whenever they tried to spend it somewhere, they'd at least be embarrassed and at the most arrested. Oh, look, the maitre d' said. A better table just became available. Right this way, please. He led them down an aisle with black-framed pen and ink sketches of all the great masters, Bonetti, Thibaut, Fabrice, Sanct, Agrippa, and Capoferro. Swords hung with naked blades on the walls between them. You should not have done that, Valentina said to him in Spanish, leaning into his shoulder as they followed. Guy's lips grew thin in a smug little grin. He changed the subject. One of the things I like about this place, he said, when you buy some of the really good bread or pastries to take with you, they wrap it up in parchment that's printed with French poetry written in script. It's reminiscent of Cyrano de Bergerac. You ever see that? Hum a few bars. A play written in 1897. Big-nosed French dueling soldier with a gift of words and a tragically unrequited love? No? She shook her head while the maitre d' stood beside their new table and conspicuously did not pull out a chair. Guy pulled it out for her instead, and she curtsied. Merci, she said, avec plaisir. The maitre d' gave them both leather-bound menus and bowed with an embarrassingly insincere graciousness before leaving. Anyway, Guy went on, in Act 2, the hero goes to the bakery of his friend Ragueneau, who's recently been bitten by the poetry bug. His wife is mad at him because they have their business to run, and instead he's sitting there writing poetry, so she takes his poems and uses them to wrap pastries. I think that's what it's supposed to be when they do it here. That's a nice touch, she said, grateful for something else to talk about than their adventure. I wonder if it's true, or if I just assumed all that. Either way, I like it. So what's good here? She opened the menu and frowned at it. It's a fusion place, he said. They've got a really good Indian version of ratatouille with an orange reduction and cardamom and a bunch of other spices. Everything except curry, I think. The lamb bourguignon is really good too. It's got cardamom, saffron, cumin, and something else I can't remember. Are you a chef or something? How do you know all the ingredients? It doesn't say it on the menu. He shrugged, pretending it was nothing, feigning humility. What do you want to drink? He asked. She flipped to the drinks page and frowned. Cosmo? He snorted. What? Have you ever had a Cosmo? Well, no. And then she laughed. I have a friend in Guate who has a restaurant, and whenever he interviews waiters, he asks them what cocktails they can make. You wouldn't believe how many say, whiskey in Las Rocas, vodka in Las Rocas, ron in Las Rocas. You're kidding. I wish I was. But we're getting better. There are a lot of good bartenders and chefs now. Okay, but if you're going to have a cocktail, don't have a Cosmo. That was a drink the fun-loving, independent ladies on Sex and the City made trendy, but that was still 20 years ago. Snob. Oh, you don't know the half of it. Well, go on then. Tell me what I should have then. A mojito? God, no. Ha! Why not? That drink is a bartender's worst nightmare. It takes 5 minutes to make, and he'll be sitting there muddling the mint leaves and thinking up ways to poison you the whole time. Long Island iced tea? Only college kids drink that. Or men trying to look cool in long-sleeve shirts that advertise fake surf shops. Really? Yeah, and they wear their hat on backwards to show they're still kids at heart. She laughed again, the tension disappearing, and she wanted him to keep going. Gin and tonic? That's for people who wear their polo shirts with the collar up and have unimaginative tattoos that show they're somewhat edgy, usually tribal or unverified Chinese characters. Oh, I know, they'll pick symbols that they think mean strength or courage, but really mean peanut butter or Tuesday. Okay, so what's next? Whiskey and ginger ale? That's for people who want others to see them drinking whiskey, but they don't really want to have to drink it. They also want to appear to play sports, so they'll saturate their wall with photos of their co-ed company softball games. They'll probably pop their collar too. So what do you drink? Raspberry Jello shots. I don't see it on the menu. Me neither. I'll have a Coke then. Good choice. What do you want to eat? I don't know. What's good? Well, they do a fusion of French and Indian cuisines, like that Italian version of ratatouille I told you about. Indian version of ratatouille I told you about. Sorry. That's really good. Roasted bell peppers, eggplant, zucchini, carrots, capers, and olives, and the sauce is a reduced orange juice with cardamom and saffron, and all kinds of stuff, really. It's good. And they have lamb bourguignon, an Indian version with cardamom, cinnamon, everything but curry. I think it's because if anyone's going to do a fusion of French and Indian food, they just make a French dish and put curry in it. So the chef here purposely avoided using curry. I like that. He second-guessed the semi-innovative. What? Never mind. Well, what are you going to have? The croque madame. She scanned the menu for it and, finding it, read aloud. Ciabatta bread with Gruyere melted on top, mozzarella melted inside, tomato, ham, mushrooms, and garlic confit? What's that? I don't know yet, he said, smiling quietly. You don't know? How do you not know? She teased. I don't know yet. Look at you all confident. So you're going to have that, and what? It has an egg on top? Yeah, fried egg. They pour this creamy sauce all over it and then put the egg, and when you pierce the yolk with your fork, the goo mixes with the sauce and it's so good. I don't believe you. You don't? No, I demand proof. I'll let you have some then. Just a bite. At that moment, the maitre d' looked up in alarm and tried to step in the way of George and the Dreadnoughts, asking if they'd had a reservation as they strode into the restaurant, but the man in black pushed him violently aside. Just remembered something, Valentina said, closing her menu. Before we came in, you said we. We came here because they have swords on the wall. Who's we? Oops, Guy thought. Game over. The moment has finally arrived, the moment I have been dreading, when I have to tell her I'm married and break the spell. He steeled himself and looked up to meet her eyes. Just as hers looked over his shoulder and widened. Zaparavo's looks curled cruelly as he came around the corner with the others, and he saw their prey. He was taken aback by the look on the man's face, though. When Guy pushed his chair back and stood to meet them, he didn't seem afraid at all. He seemed relieved, as if their presence was welcome and right in the nick of time. To this man, the threat of the dreadnoughts ranked down there with the fine for an overdue library book. The lack of fear on his face stung Zaparavo's pride. Guy reached to take a sword from the wall, a rapier, a boyish smile bearing his dazzling white teeth. He sliced the air a few times with it as they approached, getting a feel for the weight. Valentina shrank back in her seat, the terrified look on her face more befitting the occasion. "We're trapped!" she cried. Guy turned and winked at her. "Never." When Sanssouci saw Guy with the sword at the ready, he snatched another rapier off the wall and shouldered Zaparavo aside. He was delighted to have an opportunity to show off his skills in front of all the men who'd recently put him down, and with a smug tone he said to the mercenary, "This is my bag." Zaparavo scowled, and would have killed George just on general principle, but decided to let their fugitive tire himself out by killing him instead. His fist and jaw still hurt from earlier, much as he hated to admit it. George assumed the stance, his eyes burning into Guy's. Guy smiled again, composed himself, and said, "Hello, my name is Inigo Montoya. Yo killa my fara. Prepare to die." There was a pause, nobody else quite believing he'd said that, especially George. People who had been eating before the killers walked in, and had only a moment before been frightened, now began to giggle at their tables. George blinked. This man took nothing seriously at all. He'd stolen the moment and made him look like a fool. His lips grew tight and thin, and he touched the blade to Guy's in a silvery ringing glissade that made the world hold its breath. Like sprung steel mousetraps, they snapped forward and wove a shimmering web of steel between them, their blades clashing furiously. Strokes like lightning were met with impossibly deft parries and countered. Cunning feints and shrewd lunges were performed with a speed that defied reason. Their slender, wickedly delicate blades were flashes of light that dazzled the eyes of the spectators. Back and forth they went, up and down the aisles, hampered by the tables and chairs, taking care not to hurt the people sitting beside them, and that made the fighting all the more difficult. There was no freedom to use the methods of the masters on the walls. People had taken out their camera phones and were now recording it, watching the fight on the screens instead of with their own eyes, and grinning like voyeurs. Valentina sat frozen in her seat, her knuckles white as she gripped the tablecloth. George was good. Almost constant practice had given him speed and strength that made all the dreadnoughts, and even Zaparavo, grunt in appreciation. He was cold, too, and without fear. A zen-like smile curved his lips, unnerving to see. At least, unnerving to all except Guy. The look of childlike joy on the thief's face made the diners think this was a show for their entertainment, but it angered George no end. It made him start fighting to prove something instead of just to win. He had to teach this impudent fool a lesson, and that would be his undoing. He began to lunge prematurely, and often, and too often, recovering a little too late and with less dignity. It became clear before too long that Guy was better. Not by much, but enough. In many small ways, he was the better swordsman, a split second faster, a hair stronger. And that damnable smile, it shook George to see it. The din of their battle was like the clashing of cymbals in the restaurant, punctuating the upbeat jazz, and the spectators on both sides watched breathlessly until, from a low parry, Guy's point seemed to be everywhere at once, dazzling George and making him panic, and then, with a tight, deft circle, he wrapped his blade around the other and flipped it up and out of Sanssouci's hand. From the salon came a collective gasp, and Guy lunged. George's stricken face went white as he felt the point stick in his breastbone, saw the blade bend between them, saw the leer in Guy's face as he leaned in and held his gaze. For a tense moment, the tableau held, the thief making sure George knew he'd been beaten, before winking and skipping back 2 steps. With snarls of rage, the dreadnoughts pulled out ninja throwing stars and tiny knives from what seemed like thin air, and hurled them at Guy in a terrifying barrage of flashing steel. All the diners squealed and ducked this time, and only George saw the flashing web of steel that Guy wove before him. He stood there and blinked, unbelieving, as sparks flashed all around the thief. Ninja stars and throwing knives thunked into the walls and the furniture across the room, sometimes mere inches away from some innocent bystander's wide eyes.